We're here with our local orchid expert, Dr. Doug Needham. And Dr. Needham, you were a former horticulture professor and really have a passion for orchids.
I do, absolutely. I love growing orchids.
So I wanted to kind of do the homeowner, I just bought an orchid at the grocery store. What do we do with it? Can you give me some tips?
Absolutely, and the one that you've brought is probably one of the most common that we see at garden centers and grocery stores and so forth. This is the Phalaenopsis, or the moth orchid. And it's really fairly well adapted to the home environment, and they're just extremely popular, and they stay in flower for months.
Yeah.
So it makes a great houseplant. But how do you get it to last?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we grow it, we have it for the flower, and then we might pitch it.
Well, and certainly that's a choice, but let's hope that you're
going to give us some
excited
tips
about how do I grow this?
Yeah.
How do I make it flower again?
Right.
How do I keep it alive?
And now I know they usually come in the sleeve that we want to cut off.
That's right. You want to remove it from that.
And they always come with this care label. But
be careful of those care instructions.
Yes.
So what does it tell us to do?
So it tells us to water with 3 ice cubes once a week, which is equivalent to 1/4 of a cup of water. Place in bright, well-lit location. Avoid direct sunlight. 60 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, never below 55. Locate away from drafts, which is a good thing, to locate away from drafts. But ice cubes on a tropical plant?
No, do not put ice cubes on this plant.
Okay.
That's too cold. They don't want cold water. You want to use tempered water. So no, don't put ice cubes on this plant. If we want it to grow, we want it to thrive, we want it to be in our home for a long time.
So what about the 4th cup water? I mean, is that about for what the size is?
Rather than trying to limit it to quantity, the very best thing is to take this plant to the kitchen sink and literally flush it. So we're going to set the water here so that it's just cool, give it just a little more warmth, and literally then just flush that with water. And because the idea, notice how the roots are changing from white to green?
Oh, yeah.
That's that velamen layer soaking up the water. And you rinse, 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 rinse until those roots change from white to green. And then let all that excess water drip away. So, was that 1/4 cup? No, it was far more, wasn't it?
But you're letting it drain out.
You are, and that's the important thing, because it's flushing that, it's flushing any salts that have built up, fertilizer salts that may be building up in the media. It's helping to flush that through. Now all those roots have changed from white to green. They've soaked up that water so that they can transfer the water up into the plant.
And if we're doing this in a home situation with a water softener, could that salt be a problem too?
Definitely. So if you have a salt-based water softener in your home, do not use softened water on your plants, because that softener is replacing the calcium and magnesium, which is what makes water seem hard. It's replacing calcium and magnesium ions with sodium ions.
Okay, so go get some outdoor water.
Sodium is toxic to plants. Calcium and magnesium are secondary macronutrients. They're essential for plants. So no, you want to use hard water, not softened water.
All right, so what else, where would we locate this in a house?
So that part of the recommendation was good. Brightly lighted area. It doesn't want to be in full sun.
How do I know when to repot it and when not to?
Excellent question. Because many orchids are epiphytes, air-loving, you're going to see roots coming out of the pot. That's perfectly fine. They don't need to be down in the pot. They're out in the air. They're getting moisture from the air, and when you water those roots. The key to look for is that the plant will no longer be in flower. It will have finished flowering. It will begin its growth phase, vegetative growth phase. So you'll likely see new leaf coming out of this growing point here at the tip. And you'll begin to see brand new roots coming through the base here of the stem. And so when you see those little roots pushing out, and when they're about 1/2 inch long, that's the perfect time to repot your orchid, because then those roots are going to go right into that fresh medium. But there might be some that scamper over the top, and that's fine too. But you want to wait and only repot your orchid when it's in that active root phase.
All right. And how big of a pot should we go to the next time? I mean,
great question. Orchids do not like to be overpotted.
Okay.
And so this is a good sized plant or pot for this plant for probably another couple of years.
oh, okay. So I don't need to do anything right away.
Well, but it would typically repot every year because what happens is this bark that they're planted in, it will begin to get spongy. That's too far.
Oh, okay.
Because it starts holding too much moisture. And so it's really important typically to repot an orchid every year.
All right. Well, and you've got a couple of different medias that you use here.
Yeah.
What are we looking at?
So this is an orchid mix that's available at many stores, and it's a mixture of bark, and this is kind of some larger pieces of bark, and also you'll find some very coarse perlite in the mix, and then there's also little chunks of charcoal in the mix. So that's a good general mix. That would work very well for cattleyas. I wouldn't typically use that for a Phalaenopsis, but you could.
Okay.
The Phalaenopsis, as you notice, doesn't have pseudobulbs.
Right.
So it doesn't have that water storage organ that a cattleya has, for
Okay.
example. So it needs a little more moisture retentive mix. It still wants to be very well aerated, but a little more moisture retention. So I could take this and mix in a little long fiber sphagnum moss, because this will hold moisture. So I could actually mix those together. That
Could you
wouldn't be
just
bad.
use sphagnum moss? Or?
You could, and many growers do use pure long fiber sphagnum.
And this is dry, of course.
This
right
is dry,
now, yeah.
right? I just took it out of the bag. The key is that this is a long fiber premium sphagnum moss.
And
That's
you really
what you
want
want
to get that
for orchids.
hydrated, right?
Yeah, you do. You need to take this to the kitchen sink, water it, squeeze out all the moisture so that it's no longer dripping. So get it good and wet, and then squeeze out the moisture so that it's just damp.
Okay.
And now that's perfect for potting. I do want to make sure that it's clear that this is a long fiber sphagnum. It's not peat moss that you would buy at the garden center to incorporate into your garden soil, for example. Very different product. Another that's relatively new in the U.S. is a New Zealand bark, and this is from New Zealand pines, and it has a much longer life than the traditional bark-based mixes. And so this New Zealand bark, radiata bark, will last 2 or 3 years.
Oh, okay.
In the
So that
pot.
might work for my Phalaenopsis.
Yes, and would reduce then that need of repotting frequently, because you could go in this mix for probably, say, about 3 years before it would need repotting.
Okay. One last question about fertilizing then. What do we need to do and when do we need to fertilize it?
Well, I like to use the adage, fertilize weekly.
Okay.
And the 2 different spellings on that
Yes,
word, of
yeah.
course. So here in the greenhouse during the winter time, I fertilize with 50 parts per million nitrogen fertilizer. And so that's a relatively low rate of fertilizer, and I do that with every watering. And then about once every 2 weeks, I'll use a clear water to flush out any built-up salts.
Okay.
So the typical homeowner going to buy a package of fertilizer. It might say use a tablespoon per gallon, for example.
So it's usually a water soluble.
It's a water soluble. I would recommend that you use usually the little end of that is just a tiny amount. It may be a teaspoon or even less than a teaspoon.
Okay.
In that gallon of water. And so you use a very weak fertilizer solution, and you use that throughout the week.
Okay.
Every time it needs to be watered. And a Phalaenopsis typically is only going to need watering about once a week in the home.
Excellent. All right. And you'll do that throughout the season, whether it's blooming or not?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Needham, for telling us what we need to do in order to have a successful orchid.
Oh, my pleasure. You're most welcome.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.